Nearly all main Kamen Riders have at least some kind of alternate form they can access which grants new abilities and usually causes their suit to change. But who has the very most? This was an extremely difficult question to research, but after hours of organizing, evaluating, documenting, and of course counting, the results are in, and today, I, the Toku Professor, will reveal everything to all you young grasshoppers out there. Even though we're only covering the main Kamen Riders for now, this class was incredibly hard to prepare. You have no idea how many Kamen Rider forms are out there. Some are exclusive to novels and manga, others only appear in video games. Then there are Toyline exclusive forms, as well as forms that only exist theoretically. There could even be more forms out there that I've never encountered, and if so, I apologize to the writer involved for missing it, but recommend to that writer that he do a better job promoting himself. Another thing that made this a tough topic is that there are some Kamen Rider forms which are basically the same as another form with only a few minor differences, and I had to decide which forms to count and which ones to skip. Not an easy task. I'll get into how I made some, not all, of those decisions later on, but you are free to disagree with them. My last note is that we won't be covering Geats today, since at the time I'm posting this video his series is ongoing. Anyway, keeping those caveats in mind, let's get this lecture started. Up first, we have the F tier. All the riders on this tier completely failed the examination. Neither X, nor Super 1, nor Kamen Rider Shin, or Zeo have a single alternate form to their pitiful names. "We're happy just the way we are," they say. I imagine their fans are not nearly as happy at their complete lack of effort in this test of forms, because it has netted them nothing but the title of total failure. There is one rider on this tier, though, who we must give an honorable mention, namely the not-quite-masked rider, Riderman. For although my examination did not reveal a true alternate form for V3's pal, some merciful individuals might consider his various arm attachments, belt missile, and reinforced helmet to be enough to shoot this guy all the way up to the B tier. I also ran across this mysterious image that someone claimed to be a form of Riderman, but I unfortunately don't have any idea what this is from. All in all, Riderman gets an A for effort, but also an F, because in the end you gotta do more than just try. Now we can finally leave those disgusting losers in the dust and move on to the D tier. Kamen Rider V3, Amazon, Sky Rider, Black, and Stronger all have one alternate form, which is at least something, I guess. Certainly nothing to be proud of, but at least they're still eking out some kind of measly existence. Since all of these are Showa riders, the majority of these forms are rather unusual. Sky Rider's usual appearance was actually an upgrade from this form. V3 and Amazon had manga or magazine exclusive forms, and Kamen Rider Black had a pre-transformation state called Bataman. Whether this is a true Kamen Rider form is up to you. Speaking of Kamen Rider Black, if you were to group him with Black RX, he could have up to 5 forms. But I'm not doing that. Lastly, Kamen Rider Stronger had a form called Charge Up, which is actually a lot like a Heisei-era form. He is also the only known Showa rider to eventually get a final form ride, but for this class I am not going to be counting these as forms, except for one exception, because these decade-era transformations don't usually leave the transformed rider looking anything like a Kamen Rider. Again, you can disagree. That does it for the D tier. C is next. Here we have Kamen Riders 2, ZX, Black RX, J, Ryuki, Phase, Blade, Hibiki, and Kabuto. All of them have 3 total forms, including their default appearances. Notably, we're starting to see some Heisei characters now, because some of the first Heisei riders didn't have many forms. Let's take a bit of a closer look. Kamen Rider 2 used to look like this, but upgraded to a second form called New 2. No, that is not what I said. I said New 2. I decided against calling this other version of New 2 an official form because it's still technically the same form, just with an altered helmet to make it easier to differentiate Kamen Rider 2 from Kamen Rider 1. I also decided to call the manga exclusive Shocker Rider number 12 a form of Kamen Rider 2. Similarly, at the last second, I chose to call these 2 manga versions of Kamen Rider ZX official alternate forms as well. If not for my compassion, he'd be down on the F tier. There's not too much to say about the other riders on this tier, except for Hibiki and Kabuto, who could both technically argue to have more than 3 forms. Would you give it to them? No Kamen Riders officially had 4 forms, but Kamen Rider 1, the first Showa rider and the last we'll be seeing today, had 5, if you count him becoming giant to fight alongside Ultraman as a form anyway. His old 1 form had 2 variants of suits, but it is still supposed to be the same form. The other riders on this B tier are Agito, Kiva, Dino, Force, Kuga, and 01, who all have 6 or more forms. I can't mention all the notes on these riders, but I do want to bring up the topic of pre-transformation forms with Dino, and then I have a thing or two to say about 01. Kamen Rider Dino had several incomplete forms, other riders have this too, that you can often only see when the rider is in the middle of transforming. In Dino's case, he has several, and if you count all of them, his number of forms would go up to 13, and then all the way up to 15 if you count these 2 other versions of his climax form. As for 01, he has a bunch of forms that for the most part only exist as concept art, except for this one which they made a rare figure of. This is another tough situation to deal with. I went with not counting most of these, but if you threw these forms in and also counted Kamen Rider 001, Kamen Rider 02, and Kamen Rider Arc 1 as versions of 01, his total could jump to about 30, and then he'd really be a rising hopper. Let's move on. Now we're on the A- tier. Here we have Wizard, Revice, Double, Zeo, Revi, Vice, and Gaim. Other than Revice, the number of forms on all these riders was not obvious. For example, on Kamen Rider Wizard's Dragon-style forms, am I supposed to count the various Drago editions as separate forms? And what about his Flame style empowered by the Excite Ring? There were other possible forms as well with Wizard. I went with giving him 15 forms, but he could have as many as 21 by other counts. Kamen Rider Double is the only rider with final form ride forms that I chose to count. Cyclone Cyclone and Joker Joker are the names of these, and no, I'm not joking around. Kamen Rider Gaim has several arcade-exclusive forms based on past riders, and there are theoretical Zeo forms also based on older Kamen Riders. What to count and what not to count? Oh man, this is wearing me out. I don't have any energy left to faint, so let's move on. We have now reached the A+ tier. You would think this would be the cream of the crop as far as Kamen Riders with absurd amounts of forms, and you're mostly right, but believe it or not, there is still one tier above this. But let's give these guys a moment in the spotlight before the top 3 are revealed. Kamen Rider Saber, X-Aid, Drive, and Ghost all scored extremely high. Saber has about 27 possible forms, and this can be increased if you count certain other exclusive forms and add his transformation into a sword. Kamen Rider X-Aid and Ghost have tons of toy line exclusive and hypothetical forms, which can only theoretically be achieved, but even without these, both riders have very high scores, especially Ghost with about 67 forms. And official counts of Kamen Rider Drive's forms will range between 44 or 52 forms. If you are interested in how I reached that number or any of the others in this video, send me a comment and I'll try to get back to you. Congratulations to our A+ riders. Okay, it is now time to reveal our bronze and silver medalists in this contest of forms. On to the super tier. Our third and second place award winners are Kamen Rider O's and Kamen Rider Build. Now you're probably asking yourself, which of them comes in second and which in third? Now that is quite tricky. Basically, you need to be a math wizard to have any shot of figuring out exactly how many forms these two riders have. I had to consult the math teacher in the next door classroom, writing Cicada Wise, consistently for this tier, and even he was blown away by the difficulty of this calculation. You see, Kamen Rider O's transforms with 3 metals that each affect 1/3 of his body. 3 metals of a kind form a normal combo, but there are also tons of mismatched combos available, especially since there are so many different sets of metals, not just in the show, but also a bunch of lesser-known exclusive sets, such as this Cobra set from a movie and these Toyline exclusive sets. If O's were to mix and match all of these in every possible way, he'd get a number of forms in the thousands. However, Kamen Rider Build has an absolute ton of forms as well, if you aren't just counting the best matches. His suit is only composed of 2 parts instead of 3, but because of the sheer amount of different full bottles available, his count also reaches the thousands. I asked Writing Cicada Wise for an exact number of forms for both of these riders, so I could award them their proper medals. But after hours of attempting to solve this problem and failing at every turn because of the sheer amount of possibilities, Wise himself ended up taking on a new form out of frustration, and I had to get out of there. So unfortunately, I couldn't get an exact number for either of the two. But thankfully, I didn't have to, because our first place rider has more possible forms than even these two, as ridiculous as it seems. Our winner is none other than Kamen Rider Decade. Perhaps this comes as a surprise to you, since Decade on his own only has about 6 measly forms. But what you may have forgotten is that through the use of the Rider cards, Kamen Rider Decade is capable of transforming into the other Kamen Riders, and even accessing their forms through the Form Ride cards. Which means that, hypothetically, if we count Decade turning into other riders as him accessing different forms, and if we agree that Form Ride cards hypothetically exist for every Kamen Rider form out there, including all of Build's and Oz's forms, then it's an easy victory for Decade. However, since this victory is completely theoretical, we could also choose to enthrone Oz alongside Build instead, and throw Decade under the bus. But I'm far too exhausted to make this final decision. You guys can be the one. So basically what we've learned is that there is no simple answer to which Kamen Rider has the most forms, though I hope you enjoyed watching me try to give an answer. Please like, subscribe, and comment, and go watch my video on the history of Mogira to ensure you get good grades. And with all that said, I finally have a chance to show off one of my alternate forms.
The Toku Professor! Night form activated! Hush! Hush! Hush!
Good night.